Today, families waste a lot of money tossing expired food, yet some pantry staples never truly expire. Our grandparents knew exactly which foods to stock and how to store them, so they stayed safe for years. Today, those same staples can still save money and keep a household prepared when supplies run thin. So, here are 20 time-tested foods from the old pantry playbook that can stay fresh for decades when stored right. White rice. When it comes to foods that last nearly forever, white rice sits at the top of the list. Our grandparents knew that with the right storage, a sack of rice could outlast decades of hardship. The secret is in its simplicity. Unlike brown rice, which still carries its oily bran layer and eventually turns rancid, white rice is stripped clean. This means it does not spoil, provided it is kept away from moisture and pests. Families stored it in glass jars, crocks, or sealed tins, often tucked away in cool, dark corners of a pantry or cellar. Rice was not just filling, it was cheap, versatile, and nourishing, a true safety net for hungry households. Even today, a properly sealed jar of white rice can remain edible for 25 to 30 years, making it one of the most reliable staples you can keep. Pure maple syrup. Remember that old glass jug of maple syrup sitting on Grandma's pantry shelf, the one she insisted never went bad? She was right. Families treasured pure maple syrup during the lean years because it stored safely for decades when sealed tightly and kept cool. No artificial additives, just tree sap boiled down into liquid gold, thick and sweet. If crystals formed at the bottom or the syrup thickened, Grandma would gently warm the jar on the stove, and it was good as new. In those times, syrup wasn't just a treat for pancakes. It sweetened oatmeal when sugar was scarce, flavored baked goods, and gave children a sense of comfort when meals were simple and plain. Families could rely on it year after year, knowing this sweet staple would not expire as long as it was protected from air and moisture. Dried beans. Few foods fed Depression-era families like dried beans. They were cheap, filling, and when stored correctly, could last for decades. The trick lies in keeping them dry and sealed. Moisture and pests were the only real enemies, so jars, crocks, or later airtight containers became the go-to. Over time, beans may get harder, which is why soaking overnight was always important, but their nutrition stayed intact. Protein, fiber, and essential minerals made beans one of the most dependable staples in any pantry. Families relied on them in soups, stews, or simply boiled and served with cornbread. Even after long storage, they could be ground into flour or sprouted for fresh greens. A barrel of dried beans was not just food, it was a promise of survival, security, and warm meals in the toughest seasons. Raw honey was a sweet treasure in Grandma's pantry, not just for its flavor, but for its longevity. Properly sealed honey does not spoil because of its high sugar content and natural antibacterial properties. In fact, archaeologists have found jars of honey in ancient tombs still edible after thousands of years. Families in hard times used honey as both food and medicine. It sweetened bread, porridge, and tea when sugar was scarce, and a spoonful helped soothe sore throats and coughs. The key was to keep it sealed tightly, away from moisture, since water could cause fermentation. Even if it crystallized, a warm water bath brought it back to liquid form. For households struggling through shortages, honey was a comfort that lasted, offering both nourishment and a taste of sweetness that never truly faded. White sugar. White sugar was one of those staples Grandma always guarded carefully because she knew it could last for decades if stored properly. Families kept it in heavy glass jars or metal tins, away from damp cellars and out of reach of curious little hands. The secret was simple. Sugar does not spoil when it stays dry. It was the sweetener that brightened plain oatmeal, stretched scarce fruit into jams, and made birthdays feel special even in hard times. Unlike honey or syrup, sugar sometimes clumped together, but Grandma just tapped the jar or stirred it loose, and it was good as new. In homes where every bite mattered, sugar was more than sweetness. It was a sense of normalcy and comfort, proof that even in lean years, something sweet could always be found in the pantry. Salt. If there was one ingredient that never failed in Grandma's kitchen, it was salt. She kept it in stoneware crocks or heavy tins, tucked in cool, dry corners where moisture could not creep in. Salt is one of nature's strongest preservatives, and families relied on it not just for seasoning, but for survival. It kept meats from spoiling, made vegetables safe through brining, and even calmed sore throats when stirred into warm water. Salt never spoiled, never lost its strength, and could sit for decades as long as it was dry. In years when every penny mattered, salt was cheap, dependable, and always there to stretch meals and keep food safe. It turned plain potatoes into comfort food, preserved fish through long winters, and reminded families that sometimes the simplest things truly lasted the longest. White vinegar Grandma always kept white vinegar in reused glass jugs with tight lids tucked onto a cool pantry shelf. Its strength came from acidity. That natural sourness made it self-preserving, so as long as it stayed sealed and clean, it did not spoil. Families leaned on it for pickling vegetables when gardens overflowed, stretching cucumbers, onions, and beans far into winter. A splash sharpened simple meals, and a jar stood ready for canning days when nothing could be wasted. If a bottle sat for years, it was still fine to use, provided no water had been introduced. Kept away from heat and sunlight, vinegar stayed clear and dependable. In seasons, when money was thin, that steady jug gave homes flavor, food safety, and confidence that one staple would not expire before the next harvest. Dried corn. After harvest, ears hung from rafters until the kernels hardened and rattled. Then families shucked them and stored the grain in jars, crocks, or cloth sacks kept bone dry. That was the whole secret. Dry corn lasts for decades when moisture and pests are shut out. When meals ran lean, the mill or hand grinder turned it into cornmeal for breads and porridge. Hominy simmered on the stove for hearty suppers, and whole kernels became popcorn on cold nights. If water or damp air crept in, trouble followed, so the cellar corners stayed well ventilated and the containers sealed tight. Kept that way, dried corn anchored the pantry through long winters. It filled stomachs, stretched stews, and gave families a dependable staple that did not quit, a grain that waited patiently for the next meal. Baking soda. That small tin on Grandma's shelf never seemed to run out. She poured baking soda into a dry jar with a snug lid and kept it far from steam and spills. Dry was the rule. Stored that way, it stayed useful for years, ready for quick breads, cookies, and a dozen household tasks. If a tin had sat a long time, she would test a pinch in warm water with a little vinegar. If it bubbled lively, it still had lift for baking. Even when the kitchen was quiet, soda kept working behind the scenes, freshening cupboards, scrubbing pans, and softening beans as they soaked. It did not spoil when kept dry, and it did not need anything fancy. A simple container, a cool shelf, and careful hands turned a common powder into a long-lasting helper. Peppercorns. Grandpa never bought ground pepper. Whole peppercorns lived in a glass jar with a tight lid pushed to the back of a cool cupboard where light could not dull them. Years later, they were still bright and sharp because the flavor stayed locked inside the seed. When supper was thin, a quick crush in the mortar woke up a pot of beans or a stew of root vegetables. If a jar lasted ages, no one worried. Whole pepper keeps its strength when sealed and dry. Only when it is ground does it begin to fade. That is why the grinder came to the table and pepper was cracked fresh over steaming plates. Stored the old way, peppercorns offered decades of dependable spice, a small luxury that outlasted fashions and shortages, turning simple food into something worth a second helping. Instant coffee. Grandpa always had a tin of instant coffee tucked away, and it seemed to last forever. On cold mornings before heading out to the fields, he would open the jar and spoon just a little into a cup. No matter how long that jar had sat, the crystals always dissolved, giving off the same rich aroma. The secret was simple storage. Keep it sealed tight, away from moisture, and instant coffee would remain fresh for decades. For families who could not always afford fresh beans or fancy brewers, it was a comfort that needed no fuss. Even when sugar or milk was scarce, a hot mug of coffee brought warmth and energy to start the day. That little jar on the shelf meant stability, and for many homes, it was the taste of morning itself. Coconut oil. Grandma treated coconut oil like gold, keeping jars sealed tight and tucked into the pantry where light and heat couldn't touch them. It did not spoil easily, and she always knew it would be ready when needed. She used it for frying, baking, and even as a balm for cracked hands after long days in the garden. Families discovered that coconut oil, with its natural stability, could last for decades if kept cool and dry. It replaced butter when dairy was scarce and gave meals richness when options were few. For many households, just a spoonful stretched food further, while the jar itself never seemed to go bad. That quiet container on the shelf was more than cooking fat. It was security, passed along through the years, still as fresh as the day it was stored. Dried herbs. Every summer, bunches of herbs hung upside down in Grandma's kitchen, filling the air with fragrance. Once crisp, they were crumbled into jars and sealed with simple lids, ready to flavor soups, stews, and teas long after frost had killed the garden. Kept away from damp and sunlight, those jars of dried herbs lasted for decades, losing little of their strength. Families leaned on them in winter, when fresh flavors were gone, to turn plain beans or potatoes into meals worth savoring. Parsley, sage, thyme, and dill all waited quietly on the shelf, a rainbow of green that never truly expired. Those jars were more than food. They were reminders of summer warmth carried into the cold months, a taste of the garden preserved through careful hands and timeless patience. Green tea Grandma never let her tin of green tea sit near moisture or light. She stored it in airtight jars, tucked safely in the back of a cupboard where the air stayed cool and dry. Those simple steps meant the leaves held their strength for decades, offering a soothing cup whenever it was needed. Families turned to green tea, not just for its flavor, but also for its comfort, a warm drink that carried them through lean times. A single jar could outlast seasons, waiting quietly until it was called upon again. For many, tea was more than a beverage. It was a pause at the table, a shared ritual that calmed nerves and reminded everyone that even in hard times, there could still be moments of peace. Popcorn kernels. A jar of popcorn kernels sat on nearly every pantry shelf. Stored in sealed tins or glass jars, they stayed fresh for decades as long as they were kept dry. That was the key. No moisture, no spoilage. On winter nights, Grandpa would scoop a handful into the pot, and soon the room was filled with the sound of popping and the smell of butter. It was more than a snack. It was a memory, cheap and cheerful, that made the family forget the days, hardships. Popcorn was also versatile, ground into meal or stirred into treats when sweets were scarce. With its long storage life, it became a symbol of comfort that bridged generations. Those jars reminded families that small joys, carefully stored, could last a lifetime. Powdered milk. Grandma never wasted fresh milk. When it spoiled too quickly, powdered milk became the answer. She kept it sealed tight in tins or jars, away from light and moisture, and it stayed fresh for decades. It was cheap, easy to store, and dependable. Families used it to bake bread, stir into oatmeal, or mix for drinking when fresh milk was scarce. Even a spoonful could stretch recipes further, making it a lifesaver during tough times. Children got their calcium, mothers baked cakes for birthdays, and no one worried about it going bad. Powdered milk symbolized security. With careful storage, it carried families through winters and shortages, reminding everyone that a pantry could hold more than food. It held peace of mind. Dried seaweed. Though not as common in every home, dried seaweed was treasured where it was available. Hung to dry in the sun or kept pressed in airtight bundles, it lasted for decades if kept free from damp. Families relied on it for its rich nutrients, especially iodine, which kept diets balanced when fresh greens were hard to find. A strip added to soups gave depth and flavor, and children often nibbled it as a salty snack. Stored in simple jars or cloth sacks, it needed little more than dryness to stay good. For some households, seaweed was not just food, it was medicine, giving strength and energy when meals were otherwise plain. Its long shelf life made it one of those quiet, powerful staples that proved how resourceful our grandparents truly were. Chia seed. Chia seeds, tiny but powerful, were stored in cloth sacks or glass jars that never seemed to empty. Kept dry, they lasted decades, ready to swell into thick, nourishing puddings or to be sprinkled into breads and porridges. Families prized them for their energy, especially in hard-working households where every calorie mattered. Grandma knew that a spoonful stirred into water created a filling drink, giving strength on long days when food was scarce. The seed's natural oils stayed fresh for years when protected from light and heat, making them a dependable pantry staple. Chia was more than food. It was a secret weapon, compact yet sustaining, a reminder that even the smallest things could keep a family going strong through times of uncertainty. Raw oat. A sack of raw oats was like a family treasure in the pantry. Stored in barrels or cloth bags in a cool, dry place, they could last for decades without spoiling. Oats were filling, affordable, and endlessly versatile. Families turned them into morning porridge, hearty breads, and even desserts when sugar was allowed. A bowl of oats warmed the belly in winter and gave children the energy to run and play. The secret was keeping them dry and safe from pests. Once sealed, they were as reliable as any food could be. Oats were not fancy, but they carried households through hunger, turning simple meals into comfort. They were proof that sometimes the plainest foods were the most enduring, feeding families for generations without ever truly expiring. Blackstrap Molasses. Grandpa always said molasses was liquid gold, and the jar never seemed to spoil. Thick, dark, and sweet, blackstrap molasses kept for decades when sealed tight in glass containers. Families used it to sweeten bread, make cookies, or drizzle it over biscuits when sugar was too costly. It was also rich in iron and minerals, giving strength to children and adults alike when diets were limited. Stored in cool cupboards, it resisted spoilage thanks to its high sugar content, and its bold flavor made even plain meals feel indulgent. During hard times, a spoonful stirred into warm water was a tonic, both nourishing and comforting. Molasses connected the table to the past, a reminder that even in the leanest years, there was always something sweet to brighten the day. Every one of these pantry staples carried families through tough times, and the fact that many can still last for decades is nothing short of remarkable. Did your grandparents keep any of these in their kitchen, and do you still keep them today? Share your memories in the comments below. And if you'd like to discover more forgotten foods and gardening secrets from America's past, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next